Is this tolerable for you guys bright and early in the morning like this? Yeah, just barely. Well, I'm glad you're able to make it. And how many of you are here for the first time who weren't here for the, okay, good. I'm going to talk about some class logistics, and I'll talk about the course website, which you're welcome to visit. And most of the information that we covered about requirements for the class and things like that are on the course website. And everything should be pretty self-explanatory. And if you have any questions, you can just contact me or ask me questions after class. By the way, after class, I'm more than happy to stay as long as needed to answer any questions you guys have or to talk about whatever issues you'd like to bring up. But probably what makes sense is for me to power down the computer and pack up, and then we could stand out in the hallway and I can answer questions out there. That way the next class can get in and the instructor can work unimpeded. Okay, a couple of things I'll do during the semester routinely is talk to you guys about research opportunities. In case any of you would like to get involved in research, there are very often colleagues of mine or graduate students who are doing interesting projects who will ask me to alert you to the possibilities of working with them. And if you'd like to do that, you're more than welcome to. These are completely optional, not required for the course, so there's no obligation for you guys to get involved in these things. But I'll mention these as we go along in case anybody would like to get involved in working with professors or graduate students. Okay, so the first one that I'd like to mention today is Christina Roberto, who is a grad student who is working at the Rudd Center, who's right here, a teaching fellow for the class, is going to be doing some very interesting work on health policies and people's food intake. And if anybody would like to work with Christina, her email address is right there. And by the way, as you probably know already, in the afternoon after each of these lectures, we'll post the day's lectures. So if you come back and want to get in touch with Christina or anybody else, you don't have to have it now because it'll show up on the course website, this slide. But Christina's doing very interesting work. You want to stand up so people can see who you are? Okay, so if anybody has questions about this one in particular, you can ask Christina after class or at a different time. The next one is a colleague of mine, William Corbin, is doing some very interesting work on alcohol intake and gambling and sometimes how they go together. And there are very interesting research opportunities in his laboratory. And if any of you are interested in that, you can go to one of the two email addresses that you see on the bottom. And then in addition, one of the other teaching fellows here, Ashley Gearhart, Ashley, would you mind standing up? Is very active in this research. In fact, is doing some work with Professor Corbin and me jointly on the issue of food and addiction. And she'll be doing some lecturing on that later in the class. But in any event, this is an interesting research opportunity too. So again, no obligation. You don't have to do this. I won't even know if you are or not. But I just thought I would present these in the case you might find them interesting things to do. Okay, a few things about logistics of the class to help you guys navigate through various electronic things that the class has at the moment. First of all, there are two ways to get to the course website. You can go through the class's server, and then there will be an option when you pull up the tab for this particular course to go to the course website, and that will link you right to the course website. And then secondly, you can go directly to the website of the course itself that way. If any of you haven't been to the website, I urge you to do that because it has all the information about requirements, the order of readings, a lot of supplementary information that may be helpful, interesting links to other resources and things like that. So please see the course website. Second, well, we're not getting to the second one. Let's see what, okay. As I mentioned, the lecture slides will be posted almost always the same day after the class. Now, some of you may be wondering, and you'll find out this for yourself, about how important it is to come to class. What I tend to do is not discuss the readings all that much in class. I'll cover them, of course, and go over what I think the key points are. But if I don't discuss the readings in class, please don't take that as a sign that the readings aren't important. What it means is I don't want to take unique time that we could be discussing other things in class by covering things that you could have read already. There will be things in the class that are not covered in the readings and may or may not be apparent from looking at the slides online. So coming to class is probably a good idea. I mean, I'm not going to try to trick you or throw in things just to make sure you come to class, but it's usually a pretty good policy. I'm going to show you some slides on how to get at the course readings. And then we'll talk also about doing the first concept sheet. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I mentioned that the first time you'll actually have an assignment that you'll have to turn in will be next week. And these are called concept sheets, and they're 1 to 2 pages of things that you write about what's going on in the class. And they're your interpretation of what's happening in the class, not a repeat of what's happening in the class. I don't want to hear what was in the readings. I don't want to hear what was in the lecture undigested. What I'd rather have is your interpretation of things. Like, I thought this thing was really interesting and here's why. Or I remember back in week 2 of the class we talked about this issue and it links up with what we're now talking about in week 8. Or I just saw something on the news and here's how it relates. And all those sort of things are the way the concept sheets go. And if you go to the course website, there's a sample concept sheet that you'll be able to read. So the first one will be due next week. You can turn it in on either Monday or Wednesday, and typically, with the exception of the first week, which I'll explain in just a minute, the concept sheet should deal with the information that's relevant to that week. So the readings, the lectures, or something that's going on in that particular week. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have about that. But the first concept sheet has to do with this website, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay, just a little bit about navigating the information that's available for the readings of the class. Everything is available electronically. It used to be that you had to buy big, thick course packets that cost a lot of money. But now everything, thankfully, is available electronically on the course website. So if you go to the Yale Classes server and you pull up this particular class, which, by the way, has this designation as the first thing on the tab, because it's a cross-listed as a course in epidemiology and public health, and that's the first alphabetical cross-listing there happens to be. But if you pull up the tab for this course and you see over here under the course reserves, if you click on that button, then you're going to get something that looks like this, which is a list of readings for the classes. So the question is, how do you get those readings and how do you access them? Well, first is you go over here to the right-hand side for each one, and it says click here for the full text article. Pretty self-explanatory so far. And then you're going to get several different looking versions of articles when you click on that particular tab. So in this case, this is one of the articles. In fact, this was today's reading. I got here a little early. So it was this particular article was assigned for today. But what shows up when you click on the initial tab is just the abstract of the article, not the whole article itself. And so then you go over here to where it says PDF, and you click on that, and that will allow you to download the whole article, which will look something like this. And again, these slides will be posted so you can refresh your memory later on this. There will be, and here's another example of a different kind of article where when you click on the click here for full text option, you get something that looks a little bit different. In this case, oh heck, see, it looked like this. But again, it's not really the full article. It takes you to the link of the place that publishes the article, but then you have to look a little farther to download the entire article. And in this case, it would be right here where it says PDF, or also download PDF over on the right. And if you click on that, then you pull up the whole article, and then you'll have it, and you can store it or just read it, do whatever you wish, but it'll be there for the whole semester. Does that make sense? Okay, should be pretty obvious, I think. Okay, so now let's talk about the first concept sheet that's due. As I said, for every subsequent week of the class, you'll be doing a concept sheet that will be your interpretation of what's going on. But we're going to do something a little bit different for the first concept sheet that's due next week. But I wanted to tell you about it early because I'm going to ask you to do something for 3 days and then write about that. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to track what you're reading and to go to a website that will allow you to enter all your reading, and then it will print out a dietary analysis of that. And then what I'd like you to do for your first concept sheet is to write about that. Now, we don't care what you're eating, so we're not going to attend to that at all. I mean, you could eat Twinkies 4 times a day, and that could be your total diet. Or you could eat something else. It doesn't really matter so much, but it's going to be your way of analyzing your own diet and trying to make sense of it. And so what we're going to do is ask you to go to this particular website, thedailyplate.com, and at no charge, you're going to be able to enter information from your own diet. And then the program will do a dietary analysis and you can print it out. And I'd like you to do this for 3 days and then print out 3 days worth of dietary analysis of what you're eating and then write a concept sheet about it. It says, well, I didn't realize this about my diet, or I see now that I'm getting calories from this source and not that source, and things like that. So this will be an interesting experience for you if you haven't done that. Usually people find it a little bit surprising. And it also is a good lesson in how difficult it is, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent class, to actually measure what people eat. A huge amount about what we know on diet and health, like is too much sugar bad for you? What about fat? What about trans fat? What about salt? What effect do these have on our health? Comes from flawed reports of what people eat. Because in order to know what people eat, you have to ask them. And even if people are really trying hard to be truthful, it's not the easiest thing to do, and you'll find that out when you do your own dietary assessment. And that will give you some insight into how these studies are done on diet and health. So when you pull up thedailyplate.com, you'll get this website. And the first thing to do is to go over here where it says My Plate Calorie Counter. You'll actually get more information than just calories. But if you go over here, click on this, then the next version you'll see will be something like this. And in this blank area over here next to the search tab, you can type in any food that you're having. And then the program, unless it's something really unusual, the program will recognize it and then give you a series of options of things it thinks it might be. And then you can choose one of those for the specific food. Okay, so let's say, for example, if you happen to eat Frosted Flakes for breakfast one morning, then what you would do is type Frosted Flakes over here into that blank area. Okay, so you'd enter it here and then click. And then what the program will do will give you a series of things it might potentially be, because it recognizes that you could be entering more than one thing. And then you have to take the one that you think is closest to what you're actually eating. So let's just say it's the Kellogg's Frosted Flakes, and 3/4 of a cup is about how much you have. And so these serving sizes are listed here. Like here would be one small, I guess these are the small boxes. But the serving sizes are listed in the brand. And then you can click on that particular food if that's the appropriate one. So you confirm your selection after you click on it. It'll say, is this really what you ate? And if you ate it, then you say, yes, I ate this, and then it adds it to the electronic log. I guess this means you ate it with enthusiasm. And it'll also give you a breakdown of the particular nutrients of that food. So you click there, okay, and you have to pay attention to how many servings you have of something, because if it says that a serving is 3/4 of a cup, but you ate a cup and a half, then the program has to recognize that, or it won't be able to make an adequate judgment of what you're eating. So then you go over here, and it will ask you how much you consume. I've sort of blocked it out with the circles, but then you can put in 2 servings, and you put what time of day you had it. And then the program will be able to do its work, okay? Now this will be, as I said, will be an interesting exercise, and you'll get a printout that will be pretty interesting. And so you print out, you enter everything you've had for the day. Now that doesn't mean that you have to carry around your laptop and every time you eat something, enter it at the moment. But carry around at least a little piece of paper that you can write down everything you ate, because it's hard to remember later in the day. And it's hard to remember exactly how much you had of things. It's hard to remember condiments that you might have put on something. And so it's very easy not to remember everything. But it's very important to try, because as I said, this will be instructive for you, but also instructive for how this sort of happens with the course in general. So then you'll get a page that looks like this that will talk about, given that you've had that particular food, how many additional calories you have for the day, given an average person, and it gives you the breakdown of what you've eaten so far. Now that may interest you at the moment, or what you may want to do is to get a printout of the whole day after that. Okay, and of course, if you have cereal with milk, then you've got to enter the milk as well, because it wasn't just the cereal that you had. Okay, so write down everything so you don't forget it. We don't want to forget anything that you have at all. Don't forget drinks, condiments, things you snack on and stuff. Late night pizza, of course, would get entered and other things. If you guys want a seat, there are plenty of seats over here scattered about. Try to be as accurate as you can about how much of something you eat. Now, if you're not in a kitchen, it's going to be hard to measure a cup or an ounce or things like that. So you'll have to be estimating. But how carefully you estimate will determine in part how good your ultimate records are. So please try to be as careful as you can. And then pick the closest option if you can't find the exact food that you're eating at that time. And then at the end of the day, what you'll get is something that looks like this, which will be a whole day's worth of food intake. And then this is what I'd like you to print out and then write about in your concept sheets. So again, do 3 of these and then write about them in your concept sheets. So they're not due, the first one's not due until next Monday or Wednesday, so you can pick any 3 days to do it during that period of time. And then when you're done, you print the page, and we have a special instruction for that in just a moment, and then you'll have what you need for the concept sheets. All right, so to do your concept sheets, as I said, do any 3 days, attach the printouts to when you write the concept sheets, and then what I'd like is your reaction to having done this exercise. What did you learn about how easy or hard it is to keep track of what food intake is? It's also nice, by the way, that there are these electronic programs that immediately figure out the nutrient breakdown of what you're eating. It used to be the case that trained people like dietitians would have to sit down and go through, one by one and do nutrient analyses of the thing. But of course, the computer helps with that. How hard did you find it to estimate how much you were eating of something? How hard did you find it to figure out what food it was to begin with? I mean, sometimes if you have things that are a mixture of foods, like you go out for Chinese food, or you have a casserole somewhere, or you have some dish of vegetables mixed together, how do you make sense of that when it comes to entering these things into a record? Were you surprised by how many calories were in some food? Surprised on the high side or the low side? Where are your calories coming from? What about sources of protein, fat, and carbohydrate for you, and how do those look, and where are you getting those from? And then you could also think about whether there are changes that could be made to improve diet. Now again, the purpose of this class isn't to have you improve your diet. If that happens, that's fine, but that's not the purpose of the class. So we're not asking you to change anything. In fact, it's best for this particular exercise to eat as you typically would, so you get a sense of what an average day would be like for you. But it's also helpful to think, just for health and well-being in general, what might be done to improve the diet. And this will be a good way to try to get at that. And several notes. The website will never ask you for identifying information. This particular website has this free nutrient analysis that we talked about here as sort of an entree to other options on the website people may choose to get involved in. And there may be charges for those things, I don't really know, but there may be, and then they may ask you for identifying information. But it's your option to do that. You don't need to. If you want to take advantage, then you can, but you don't need to. And then also, you'll be asked to do identifying information if you print it out from the program itself. But if you go up to your web browser print option and print from that particular thing, then you can do it and no identifying information will be necessary. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, good. This should be a very interesting exercise and fun to think about a dietary analysis like this. Okay, now let's get on to the course topic for today, which is food and evolution. There have been major changes, of course, in the food supply. It's happened over the course of, millions of years of human evolution, but it's happened also in a relatively recent time frame when we think about the American diet and what people are eating, but also the world diet, of course. Here's a picture of a cover from the journal or the magazine The Economist, who were writing about food and nutrition in modern times, and they created this graphic for the website to show the evolution of humans. And so they show these as some of the first stages. And then intermediate stages they depicted as this. And then the final one is this. So notice the large beverage in this fellow's left hand. So this is a really pretty dramatic change in human evolution. And the question is, what happened? What made things go so awry that people and food used to be more in sync in terms of health and well-being, although there were problems in some ways? Why did this happen, and then what's the impact? What is all this doing to us? Now, several lectures down the road we'll talk about modern food and epidemiology. That is, what is the research on food intake and human health? And what do we know about our health and well-being based on diets? But let's talk about more ancient societies and how food got started and what sort of phases we've gone through and how does that shape what's going on today. If you look at the percent of time people in society were involved in various activities and broke it into agriculture versus everything else, in ancient Egypt it looked like this. So basically, the whole society was spending all of the time raising enough food just to support life. And there was only 5% left over, and that ended up being used in ways like this. So obviously, with this sort of partitioning of behavior and activities and effort, there's not a lot of time left over for leisure, for development of new technologies and things like this. So agriculture pretty much overwhelmed everything else. And if you think about what ancient food gathering habits used to be like, you see things like this, where people are out gathering food that is growing naturally. And you can think about what sort of conditions this would create and what kind of hardships it would create. Well, first, you're subject to the food not growing. If there are droughts, pests, other things that interfere with the growing of the food, you've got problems. And that made some populations mobile because they had to move from place to place to find food, but of course it made starvation a very real possibility. In different parts of the world, you would see this sort of activity for finding food. But again, the elements were harsh. Finding food may not have been easy, and certain sorts of diets would prevail over others, where there would be a lot of certain nutrients and few of other ones, and humans suffered as a consequence from nutritional deficiencies in almost all parts of the world because there weren't complete diets. And then you see way back in human histories figures like this, where people had to go hunt for their food, and of course there was danger involved in this, uncertainty of the food supply and the like. So this is all pretty well known. So this is captured in this little quote by Woody Allen. And we get to modern conditions where we see something like this. Now here we have a situation where you have a completely concocted food. You have something like Twinkies to begin with, not something found in nature. And then we concoct them even further by deep frying them and then having them with a sugared beverage. And that's certainly different than ancient times. And we see what the environment has become. And here you see something where there's deep fried Twinkies, deep fried candy bars, deep fried onions, and deep fried Coca-Cola. Has anybody ever had deep fried Coke? How is it?
It tasted like Coke with a lot of oil.
It tasted like Coke with a lot of oil. Yeah, because it's like fried dough, isn't it? They make it like that, but instead of water or whatever, they put Coca-Cola into it. Interesting. Okay, so one brave soul admitted to having fried Coke. Thank you for doing that. But there's a lot of frying going on at this particular place. And this is something that's not typical of ancestral human diets. And so if you think about the modern food environment compared to the ancient one, so let's say somebody getting something at a fair, compared to the old days, well, how do these two humans differ in their relationship to food? And what type of different foods were they eating and how much effort went into getting them? So here you have somebody who's happy, at ease, and completely secure that there will be food around the corner. There's never any question at all about whether one can eat. Now, it could be that you're hungry, but you're working hard, and so you may not get your food for an hour until after you're hungry. There may be a little bit of uncertainty about that. There may be a little uncertainty about whether the pizza place is still going to be open late at night when you will get hungry. There may be uncertainties of that nature, but certainly not the uncertainties of early humans. And so you have somebody like this who would be frightened to death about getting the food. And you have somebody over here who has a completely different relationship with it. And what does that mean? Does it change how humans appreciate food, what it does to their relationship with food, and of course, what it does to their health and well-being? So things have changed a lot. And you also have to factor in here how much physical work is involved in getting the food. So on the left, you see somebody expending enormous physical effort to secure the food. Here are humans who had to walk long distances potentially to find the food, kill the food at great risk to themselves, inspiring a cascade of physiological effects that have to do with fear and arousal and things like that, not to mention all the calories one would burn doing this kind of activity. And then there would be the butchering of the animal, there would be the securing the crops from the fields and then bringing it to wherever you were going to eat it, which burns more calories and requires more physical effort compared to the person on the right that really doesn't have to do much at all. So this shows part of the changed relationship with food. Now, if any of you are interested in exploring this issue of food and history, there's an awful lot written about it. A number of books that have been written about it that are quite good. One that I found most instructive is called The Cambridge World History of Food, which is this two very large volumes, edited volumes with a number of smaller chapters in them on food and history, and they're really very good. I'm not sure if the Yale Library has this or not, but if they don't, you could ask the librarian to get it. But it's an excellent resource that talks a lot about the history of food. So some of the things that I'm about to talk about are drawn from chapters in that particular volume. Now we'll go back further than 10,000 years to talk about the history of food. But at 10,000 years ago, several very important changes happened that have shaped to a great extent what our modern relationship with food is. And that was the planful growing of food and the domestication of animals. So we'll loop back to this in just a moment, but start by going back earlier in history. So this Cambridge History of Food talks about three separate primary phases in human food evolution. One beginning 1.5 million years ago, another about 700,000 years ago, and then the 10,000 year ago one that I talked about just a moment ago. So phase one, 1.5 million years ago, in the late Miocene and early Pleistocene phases, there was a shift where people were less likely to be just going out and gathering foods from every place they could find it, to some planting of food, although not a lot, but also dealing with food in different ways. Instead of just eating it at the time, there would be processing of it. There would be some sort of cooking, some attempt to store food for when people may have been hungry later, etc. And then going from a plant-based diet to a diet that included meat. Now these were important changes because humans, of course, are omnivores and can eat both plants and animals, and therefore the ability to secure nutrients from these different sources became very appealing to humans. Phase two, in the Middle Pleistocene phase, 700,000 years ago, then we got into more deliberate hunting of animals. Larger species were hunted, and then you started to see humans eating things like mammoth, deer, horse, bison, and reindeer, and humans banded together instead of working more as individuals and started hunting animals in groups of animals hunted by groups of humans. And the plant diet at this point was still quite important. Then the phase three that I mentioned, the 10,000 years ago, had several things occur that were very important in shaping our current situation. So we have modern patterns of climate, vegetation, and fauna. So the climate conditions were somewhat similar to today. Several large animal species had disappeared, so people had to find other animals, and so this changed from going to find animals to domesticating animals, and shift from collection of plants to production of plants. So because of the climate and because of certain things growing in different parts of the world, and by the way, I see some of you kind of struggling to keep up with some of the things I'm doing in the slides, but I'm hoping to make broad points here, and again, the slides will be posted on the website, so don't worry so much if you're not able to get everything down. So in certain locations, things were dominated by certain cereals. Rice in Asia, wheat in Europe, sorghum and millet in Africa, and maize in the New World. And these then became the objects of trade, of commerce, and of course of human diets. And these had nutritional implications for people in different parts of the world. And so the people who write about food history have called these things superfoods, not necessarily because they're super rich in all nutrients, but because they were super available. The ubiquity, not the nutrition, was what got them called superfoods. But they became dominant foods in different parts of the world. And so you can see in the New World, with maize being important, how America has become a corn-dominated society. Even though it's still true that we raise wheat, we raise other things in the United States, and we can import different foods, corn has become an incredibly important constituent of the diet in the US. And later in the course, we'll talk about how much of your body has been influenced by corn, how much of your diet is influenced by corn, how many products you touch in a given day have been derived in some way from corn, and it's really quite amazing. That would not necessarily be true in other parts of the world, but it is true in this part of the world. Now, the fact that people were so reliant on certain foods led to deficiencies of certain nutrients. So people that were dependent on a rice-based diet tended to have problems with deficiencies in protein, vitamin A, and thiamine. Now, again, this is the kind of detail I'm not expecting you to remember, but it's just an exemplar of this broader issue about how dependence on certain foods leads to nutritional deficiencies. They have to get remedied somehow, or else people have health problems. And so either people in these populations were malnourished, or they had to find supplementation for these superfoods in order to survive. This is an interesting quote about maize from this particular book called Prehistoric Food Production in North America. And if you have trouble reading it, I'll read it. By the time of Columbus, maize had already become the staff of life in the New World. It was distributed throughout both hemispheres, from Argentina and Chile, northwest to Canada, and from sea level to high in the Andes, from swampland to arid conditions, and from short to long day lengths. And becoming so widespread, it evolved hundreds of races, or types of corn, each with special adaptations for the environment, including special utilities for man. Now, there's a lot is hidden in this, this particular quote. Number one is because corn was or maize was so important during this period of time, but it was grown in many, many different conditions: high altitude, low altitude, short days, long days. Hundreds of species of maize developed, and that led to great biodiversity. And that meant that people growing corn were less vulnerable to having things wipe out entire crops, because there were different types of crops planted around the world. So the world corn supply would never be threatened by anything. But as we'll talk about later in the class, the biodiversity has shrunk. So what used to be hundreds of varieties of corn is now just a few. As I'll explain later in class, in Florida, there used to be many, many, many varieties of oranges, and now there are about 4. And there are commercial reasons for this occurring, but the biodiversity has shrunk for various reasons of profitability, and as a consequence of that, things like corn crops and the orange crop in Florida are particularly susceptible to certain environmental conditions, certain pests, and certain types of blight. Because of that, large amounts of particular types of pesticides and fertilizers and the like have to be used to defend against these outside threats, and those bring their own series of environmental consequences. So we'll go into that in some detail. But it's interesting how humans and plants have evolved together. And there's a very interesting book on this by Michael Pollan called The Botany of Desire. Now we're reading another book for the class by Michael Pollan, not this particular one, but this book is a pretty quick read and it's extremely interesting. And his premise in this book is that humans have become dependent on plants and animals animals have become evolutionarily dependent on humans at the same time. And so this idea that the human body has evolved to be able to take in certain sorts of foods, and that the foods have evolved at the same time and they become dependent on one another is an extremely interesting premise, and Pollan writes beautifully. So this is an interesting book worth exploring, and I'd urge you to read it if you get the opportunity. So this idea that humans have evolved, that physical changes have occurred in humans as a consequence of their food environment has led us to where we are now. And I alluded to this a little bit in the first class about how humans have evolved to seek out energy because famine was the largest threat, is one example of this. Now there are challenges to a plant-based diet which made eating meat important to humans in human history. Some of the challenges that you see here I mentioned before. So there's problems with drought, with pests, with temperature changes and the like. There were also issues about nutritional adequacy, and meat turned out to be a better overall food than most plants. Now that seems counterintuitive now because we think that a plant-based diet may be more healthy for people than a meat-based diet. But remember that we're fighting off overnutrition, and these folks were fighting off undernutrition. The plants can be deficient in certain things, especially fat-soluble vitamins that come from meat and from essential amino acids. And so in order to have a completely balanced diet that's completely plant-based, one has to be very careful about having a wide array of foods. And a narrower array of foods is necessary for nutritional adequacy if people are eating meat. Now that's not to say that this has implications for what people are eating now, but it certainly did at one point. There are changes in food and agriculture that made a number of things possible. Once it became true that people could raise food or gather food or produce food for more than just themselves or their families, meant that people were free to do other things. Not everybody had to be involved in creating food. And so that gave people more time to trade, to develop other products, to be involved in non-food pursuits and many, many more things. So it was a major change in human evolution where people started raising animals in large groups or started growing plants in large amounts. And there were some landmarks along the way. So the plant-based economies began in the Middle East and then they spread to the rest of the world. This was thought by many to be a positive change, but in game-rich environments where there was a lot of meat available, people could actually get many more calories per hour, that is, secure more food that would help fend off starvation compared to what they could get for people cultivating food. So economically, it made more sense to eat meat under those circumstances. But of course, the meat didn't exist in all places of the world, so some people were dependent on plants. And so change comes from necessity. People have to evolve to have a biology that tolerates the subsistence that they have access to, and that varies in different parts of the world. So again, humans evolve. And so this quote from Larson in the Cambridge World History of Food captures this. Virtually every major anatomical change, think about that for a minute, every major anatomical change that has existed in humans can be related in one way or another to how foods are acquired and processed by the human body. Quite a remarkable statement. And I was reminded of this when I saw this cartoon. So there's an anatomical change for you. But things, of course, have changed since those early times in so many ways. And if you go back to this particular graphic, The interesting thing is, how have humans changed and what are they like now? Well, now the food environment is things like this. And so instead of hard labor to go get food, all it requires is a little drive-in to the window. And you know, it used to be the case, I forget how long drive-in windows have been around, certainly as long as you guys can remember, but there was a time when drive-in windows didn't exist. And when that was the case, if you wanted fast food, you had to at least spend the calories to get out of your car to walk into the place to buy the fast food. And now you're saving a few calories because you don't even have to do that. So the food environment's changed in a lot of ways. People even get coached on how to do it. So when drive-in windows were introduced recently in Malaysia, these little graphics went out to show people how you actually use the drive-in window. McDonald's created these. So you drive your car in, it shows you by the arrows where you go. You stop at window 1 to make your order and pay, and then you go to window 2 to collect your food, and they're open 24 hours. So again, it shows how much things have changed during that period of time. And even if you're a moose, you can get fast food. Here's another example of that. So back to this graphic again. Unpredictable food supply occurred on the left, but doesn't occur on the right. Starvation was a major threat on the left, but not on the right. And the top priority on the left was to bank energy. The top priority on the right has become to spend energy. And so a completely different way humans are interacting with food. Now these changes, these human evolutionary changes, have created some very interesting metabolic things inside our bodies. Okay, so we talked about the strong biological drive in the last class for sugar, fat, and variety. Okay, people need fat, they need sugar, and they need variety. At least that's what their brain thinks. But the brain thinks that you exist in climates or conditions where food is likely to be scarce some of the time. And so the brain hasn't evolved fast enough through periods of evolution to keep up with a rapidly changing food environment. And that's what creates problems. So if you have a brain and a body and a metabolism that wants calories, it wants fat, it wants sugar, it wants a broad variety of foods so you can survive, that would be good if you lived in certain parts of the world today. Now these parts of the world are shrinking in number, but let's say you lived in Ethiopia or Somalia or places where food really is scarce way too much of the time. Then having this particular biological drive, having a brain that wants you to seek out these foods, would be highly adaptive. But in cultures where the food environment doesn't represent the conditions the brain expects, you've got a mismatch. And that's where we have problems. And so as I mentioned in the earlier class, most of you would probably rather have some high-fat food like French fries or ice cream or some type of a dessert than have cauliflower or have broccoli or have Brussels sprouts. So why does your body experience one food as highly pleasant, highly reinforcing, highly comforting, highly soothing even, and experience those other foods as bitter and unpleasant? Now, some people may be turned off by those high-fat foods. You might have trained yourself to do that. And there may be cultural reasons why you like broccoli better than Haagen-Dazs, let's say. Some people can train themselves to do it, but it's contrary to the way the brain wants you to behave. Because if you were unfettered by all those environmental things that make people eat different kinds of foods, most of you would probably like the high-fat, high-sugar foods better. Most of you probably still do. Now, you might be able to resist them and not eat them in abundance, but they're still there, and the brain likes those sort of things. Well, that's thanks to your ancestors and thanks to the conditions that they've inherited, that you would seek out a diet that has those particular conditions. There's also something that scientists have talked about called the thrifty metabolism. A thrifty metabolism means you make very good use of your calories. Now, if you think around to the people you know, you probably are aware that there are pretty important differences between people in how much they eat and then how well those calories get banked. Now, the bank for calories is body fat. If you take in more calories than you consume, it gets stored in the fat cells. That's the energy bank that you can draw upon if you don't have enough food and starvation or famine were an issue. People do that with differing levels of efficiency. So each of you probably know, some of you may be in this category yourself, people who can eat like crazy and still not gain weight. And those people are the envy of many other people. So you can eat and eat and eat, and those people don't gain weight. Then there are other people who are pretty careful about what they eat, and they're still prone to gain weight. Well, those are differences in metabolism. Calories go in, food gets consumed, the body metabolizes or makes use of those particular nutrients. And in that process, there's a metabolic engine at work. And some people have an efficient engine so that the calories in get banked in the fat. Other people have an inefficient engine, that is, the calories get wasted as body heat and things like that, and they tend not to gain weight. So that efficient metabolism that banks calories, highly efficient, highly important, highly adaptable under circumstances where food is scarce, but not efficient and not adaptive under modern food conditions in the developed world. But the behavior that comes from this hard wiring manifests itself in several different ways. It means that we want to eat when there's food around. And it doesn't matter so much whether we're really hungry. I mean, think of going out to a nice dinner, you're completely full, your body doesn't really need more calories necessarily, your stomach has had enough, and then the dessert cart comes by. Or there are the mints on the way out of the restaurant or something. Okay, people have those, they want them. Why? It's because food is there. Not because you necessarily need it at the moment, but your brain tells you you may need it later. And so eat, eat, eat becomes the priority. The satiety, or the feeling full, having enough, being sated, gets trumped by the presence of food. And I just mentioned examples of that. So the organism seeks out fat, sweet, and variety, and eating large amounts of food becomes a priority, at least according to the brain. Some people can fight the brain off in this case and control their food intake, maintain a healthy diet, and maintain a normal weight. But the number of such people in the population is shrinking by the day. And so as we see prevalence of obesity and diet-related diseases going up around the world, country after country, year after year, you can see how the environmental conditions are trumping people's thoughts about what they should eat, knowledge about what's healthy to eat, and the like. And so the brain and the environment are mismatched at this time, and that's created havoc in a lot of different ways that we'll talk about. And we can think about this in an evolutionary way, as I've alluded to a lot. But if you think about it from a completely Darwinian point of view, and you think about these food conditions where food would be scarce in ancient times, who were the organisms that would survive those conditions and then contribute to the gene pool? Well, they're the ones who would do the behavior things that we mentioned before. They're the ones who would seek out high fat, high sugar diets because then they would get calories, to seek out a variety of food, to eat above what immediate hunger might dictate. Those people would bank their calories, survive the next famine, contribute to the gene pool, and thereby create what we have today, which are organisms, humans, who very much like the kind of diets that are creating problems. And so it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. And if the food environment had evolved very slowly, as it had in earlier human history, the body would have a chance to adapt. And natural selection would create people who were in sync with their environment. But as I said before, the food environment has changed very quickly, and people have not. So the ones who would seek out calories, the ones who could store and not waste energy, those with an efficient metabolism, that is, those people who took in calories and banked them into their body fat and stored against subsequent famine, are the ones who would do the best under these circumstances. And the ones who would conserve energy, that is, they were sedentary when possible, other than when they had to go get food, would again not waste their calories but would save them and contribute to the gene pool. So doesn't it make sense then that being sedentary and seeking out high fat, high sugar, high calorie foods has become a priority, woven into our biology, but we're mismatched with environment. Here's a little video clip that I'd like to show you that talks about evolution and how humans have evolved in relationship to their food. This was a series put together by a British filmmaker who's actually narrating this, named Anthony Thomas, who did a terrific, I think, 6 or 7 part series for British television, and several of those got collapsed into a 1-hour special on Nova that was shown in the United States. But he sent me this because he interviewed me for this series of films and sent me some clips, so I'd like to share this one in particular with you. Actually, I have 3 that I'll show you. Can we crank up? Okay.
Why all animals crave fat. Fat cells are the body's larder, storing energy against times of famine and extreme cold. And the human brain, like any animal brain, craves it. It is a primitive survival instinct.
Fat is a very precious commodity in the world that we emerged from in the African jungle, where people lived on fruit and berries and wild game where there was almost no fat. The choicest foods were the fatty, flavoursome fruits. And I think that the human brain, many animals as well, have been built to recognise fat, sugar and salt as part of the primeval survival mechanisms. Now we're handicapped because we have fat everywhere, but we still have those brain mechanisms charging away.
This fellow who was just interviewed on this is a man named Philip James, who's in London and runs a group called the International Obesity Task Force. And probably more than anyone in the world knows the world's situation about food and food policy. But in this case, he's talked about fat and talked about the survival mechanism that's so important for fat. Now, another clip from that same Anthony Thomas series I'd like to show you here. And in this case, one of the people being interviewed is a woman named Susan Jebb, who is a prominent researcher in the UK.
Soothing, comforting fat. The smell, taste, and texture of it intoxicates the senses.
Fat is the magic ingredient. When fat is used in cooking the food, you get that extra sensory experience. It's what makes things have great texture. It can be a crispy texture. It can be a wonderful fudgy texture in the case of a delicious piece of chocolate cake. This inimitable mouthfeel that we get from fat is what delivers flavor to our palate.
Fat adds taste and texture and palatability to food. We do seem to like the taste of fat. When we expose people to high-fat foods, they very frequently and regularly overeat. They consume far more energy than necessary. And we just don't get that same phenomenon when they're exposed to either high carbohydrate or high protein foods.
So something about fat is driving people. And as I'll explain in a subsequent lecture, what would it be about fat that makes it more reinforcing than protein or carbohydrate? Anybody guess? Go ahead. Okay, the higher caloric density. Fat has twice the calories per unit weight that protein or carbohydrate, sugar, has. As a consequence, has the greatest survival value. So that music, the sort of seductive feel that was into this video, is how humans feel about fat. You can smell the bacon when people make it in the morning. The idea of French fries cooked in fat becomes appealing to people. Things that are high in fat, and then high in sugar too, like ice cream, become very appealing to individuals. And so these foods become incredibly powerful for people, incredibly powerful. And so people in the United States and increasingly in other countries around the world are eating way too much fat. They're also eating way too much everything else, but they're eating way too much fat. Most of those people know they shouldn't. And so when there's this disconnect between what people think they should do and what they actually do, and so many people are involved in this, so many people are affected by it, it gives you a sense of how powerful biology can be and how it can override people's common sense, education, and knowledge, and all part of evolution. So counteracting those things becomes pretty important. Now, the paper that was in the readings by Boyd Eaton talked about this, and there are some people who have talked about returning to an ancestral diet. Now, we'll talk in a subsequent class about what the ideal diet is. Experts differ on this, and people have their favorite nutrients. And this gets played out in diet books, so you have the low-fat diets, you have the low-carb diets like Atkins, et cetera. And even the experts who aren't out there trying to make a fortune on diet books have their own favorite foods and things. So what to eat, what the optimal diet is, has become a pretty controversial issue. But some people have said, let's go back to what our ancestors ate. It worked for them. They didn't have all these chronic diseases like we have. Now, they had other challenges, infectious diseases primarily, but they didn't have the chronic diseases like we have, like cancer, heart disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, et cetera, and diabetes particularly. So let's go back to the old diet. And Eaton is one of the main proponents of that sort of philosophy. Now, you can come to your own conclusions about whether that makes sense, and we'll go over different dietary approaches as we go through subsequent classes. But it's an interesting philosophy. Excuse me. So if you compare ancient humans to what modern people eat, let's look at different constituents of the diet. Fat is not all that much different. But one thing that's happened is the type of fat has changed a lot. And so people are eating less fat from plant sources and more fat from animal sources, and that's where the saturated fat comes in. And high saturated fat intake is not a good thing. Carbohydrate has really shifted, and so people are eating more calories from carbohydrate before, sugars primarily, and that is coming primarily from added sugar, or that's at least one of the primary contributors. Now, the added sugar before, does anybody remember from the Eaton article how ancient humans added sugar to things? Honey, yeah, honey was the one place where it may have come from. But of course, now there are lots of ways to add sugar to things, and sugar is everywhere and added to foods you wouldn't expect. We did a little study once in our group testing the following hypothesis. Now, we never completed this study, so we never wrote it up, but we did find some interesting preliminary things. Our hypothesis is that in the United States, it's less expensive to sweeten things than it is elsewhere in the world. And part of that is because of high fructose corn syrup that we'll talk about later in the class. But it becomes very inexpensive to sweeten things. And so why would you sweeten things? Well, in the United States, well, because you can, because it's less expensive to do so than it is elsewhere in the world. And people naturally like sweet taste. And so if you have a product and your competitor has a product and you put sugar in yours, people are going to like it better. And so sugar shows up in all sorts of interesting places where you wouldn't expect it necessarily. Large amounts of sugar in peanut butter. Large amounts of sugar will go into things like stews and soups and things like that where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. And that's because you can add sugar. People will naturally like it better. So our little study hypothesized that foods that you could buy in the United States would be sweeter and have more sugar in it than the same foods that one could buy in other countries. And so we started collecting cereals and things like that from various countries and found in this preliminary study that it was the case. The American foods were sweeter. But again, pretty preliminary and not a complete study. Protein was a lot different in this period of time, and many health authorities think a higher protein diet would benefit humans. Fruits and vegetables, of course, were much different. This is one of the most striking findings, and it's not surprising, therefore, that people should be eating more fruits and vegetables, and our ancestors were eating much more. And then fiber was tremendously different as well. And fiber is related to risk for some diseases, particularly some cancers, And therefore, the low fiber intake that we have now compared to what our ancestors had is a factor. And the fiber intake is affected not only by what particular foods people pick, but how processing is done of the foods they have, where some of the fiber in foods is specifically processed out. So we'll talk about that later in the class. So the question is, why do people eat so much? And this is pretty much the answer: because they can. Because humans want to eat a lot, they want to bank their calories, they want to seek out foods that are high in sugar, fat, and variety, and if those are available, then they're going to be eaten and we've got problems. This is a normal weight laboratory rat, given much more than it could necessarily eat of standard laboratory food. Now in this particular case, these animals will not overeat on the healthy, balanced food and won't gain excess weight. They'll maintain a normal weight. But if you throw off the environment, in this case the animal's biology, its drive for certain nutrients, is in concert with the food it has access to. So this diet, although it's processed by a company and sold for people doing animal studies, it more or less mimics what these animals might be eating under natural conditions. But if you change the animal's environment and you give it access to these sort of foods, and these are the pictures that I showed you in the first class, and you remember I asked you what constituents of this diet promoted obesity, and you said it was fat, sugar, and variety. That was correct. So this normal weight animal like this has its whole equilibrium thrown off, its homeostasis thrown off when its dietary conditions change. And what you get is quite a heavy animal, but that looks like a pretty happy rat, doesn't it? Well, why would it be happy? Well, it doesn't have to go out and search for food. It's right there. It can eat whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And in this case, banking energy trumps good nutrition, because the pellets of the healthy diet are in the pile. And if nutrition trumped conservation of energy, the animal would eat those pellets and maintain a normal body weight. But the animals under these conditions pretty much ignore this. They ignore the healthy food. They seek out the foods that are higher in sugar, fat, and variety and become quite overweight. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier class, variety becomes interesting, because if you could somehow put these piles of food in, take each of the foods separately and put them in separate piles and find out which food the animal preferred, and then gave it just that, instead of a mix of foods, even less preferred foods, you wouldn't get nearly the degree of overweight that you get if you mix up the foods, because the variety is important. All right, so what better mimics modern human conditions than fat, than sugar, and variety? So those foods that you see there that throw off the animal's homeostasis and their hunger equilibrium are the same foods that are marketed very heavily. I don't know if any of you watched tennis recently, but the US Open has been shown, and there's an Oreo advertisement with the Williams sisters. And so that's why people know about these foods, not that particular one, but in general. So these foods are heavily marketed. They tend to be sold in schools. There tend to be mini markets right outside the schools, so people can get them on the way to and from schools in many places. And this is the food environment. So when the animals respond by doing this, how can we be surprised the humans do it? And it starts to teach us some lessons about, if we're going to change the food environment for the better, if your job, let's say, is a public health official and you'd like to help people change their diets, how are we going to do it? Are you going to focus on willpower, restraint, and personal responsibility and try to educate people, give them the skills and the knowledge it takes? Or are you going to say that that will only take us so far, and it's the conditions that are messed up, and we have to do something about the conditions to make it easier for people to make healthier choices? And we'll talk about those two different approaches as we go through the class. Now, it's not uncommon, by the way, for laboratory animals in these studies to triple their body weight. So take your own weight in your mind and multiply it by 3. And again, there's no advertising affecting this. There's no parents being irresponsible and buying sugary cereals for the poor little animals. There's none of this. This is raw intersection of biology and environment. So again, when we see this evidence, then it starts to help guide us about what we might do to make changes in society in general. And again, to show you the difference, a different perspective from a different point of view about the impact of this diet, you can look at something like that. So what we have is ancient genes are mismatched with the modern environment. Here's another video clip from that same series that speaks to this issue. This one's beautifully done.
30 miles south of Phoenix, Arizona, the Casablanca Highway skirts the border of the Gila River Indian community. For at least 2,000 years, the Pima people lived and farmed here. But in the early years of this century, white settlers diverted the upper waters of the Gila River. Pima's irrigation canals ran dry and the land died. Then, after years of hardship, their fortunes suddenly changed. In 1984, the Pima were granted a casino concession in the heart of this prosperous American state where casinos are otherwise forbidden. The links to their ancestral lands broken, the Pima have joined the American mainstream. But that wasn't many years ago, and now what to do in time. Today, the Arizona Pima share the American culture, the American lifestyle, and the American diet. But in one important respect, they've outdone their fellow Americans. They are now the fattest population group in the fattest country on earth.
I have 1245, 145, and 245 deaths on the 11th.
In this state-of-the-art hospital, the Pima cope with diseases that doctors have linked to obesity. Hypertension, high blood pressure, several forms of cancer, bone, joint and muscle strains, sleep apnea and diabetes. A staggering 60% of Pima adults are diabetic. The dialysis clinic, operating 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, treats 18 patients at a time. In this hospital, they are proud of their achievements, and rightly so. No one pays for treatment, and the whole population is carefully monitored. The Pima have also allowed the American government to use their hospital as a human laboratory. 11,000 Pima volunteers have participated in an important long-term study of diabetes and obesity for the National Institutes of Health.
I'm going to take a couple.
The Pima of Arizona know that theirs is a community in crisis. Miles to the south, high in the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico, there's another Pima community of just 700 people whose ancestors separated from the main tribe and migrated here nearly 1,000 years ago. These Pima of the Sierra Madre are, on average, 60 pounds lighter than their American cousins. Diabetes and obesity are virtually unknown here. The only thing that distinguishes the two groups is lifestyle. The Mexican Pima farm and live as their ancestors did. There are no labor-saving devices here, not even electricity or piped water. You walk, you ride, and if you're late for school like Maria and Cedro, you run all the way, 3 miles. spent 22 hours a week in hard physical exercise. In Arizona, the figure is less than 2. And here they eat a traditional diet of fruit, vegetables, and corn tortillas, high in fiber and low in animal fat. For scientists, the striking physical difference between the two branches of the Pima Nation perfectly illustrates the impact of modern living on weight and health.
Now, this is a very striking visual display of how much difference an environment can make. Now, one could say that there's something peculiar about biologically about the Pimas who live in Arizona, who that makes them so much at risk for diseases like diabetes. However, their biological relatives in Mexico would presumably have that same risk, but it would never be manifested if they're not exposed to what some have called a toxic food and physical activity environment. So because of that, we have a set of environmental conditions that have enormous impacts on people. Some people in the population are more biologically vulnerable than others, and the Pimas appear to be one of those groups. But it's all different degrees of terrible, if you will, because so many people in the population share that biological vulnerability, and when the environment changes, we have the problems. So again, we have to ask ourselves, we have to start thinking of the question about what does this mean for doing something about changing the world's diet, changing the nation's diet, changing the world's diet. And do we rely on individual behavior and education, or do we try to do something about the environment? So food has changed in a lot of ways from the early ancestral days. The amount of food available is striking. I mean, even in the period of time since I was a child, there are a lot of changes that have occurred, and I mentioned some of this in the last class, but when I was a child, you didn't have rows and rows of food at a drugstore. Gas stations sold gas, and that was it. There might have been one Coke vending machine in my high school, if any, I don't even remember. And that's just in my lifetime. And think about how grossly things have changed starting in those earlier times. So food is basically available to people all the time in many different forms, coming in many different ways. The calorie density has changed because food is processed. So the calories and the fat and the sugar that can get squeezed into things, made possible by technological changes, has shifted things a lot. Portion sizes, and we'll devote a class to this later on, have gone way up, and that's a big problem. The amount of processing I mentioned. We'll talk specifically about how many calories people are consuming in liquid form, which has gone way, way up. The number of calories you guys consume as a part of your diet, if you're the average person, is much higher than used to be the case. And that has very interesting biological implications that we'll discuss. Your body interprets liquid calories different than it does calories in solid food. And of course, the physical work securing the food has changed a lot. So these are very profound changes, and it has led to the humans that we are today. And it's important to understand the ancestral diet to see why we've evolved, the biological reasons we are the humans we are today. But it also helps instruct us about what we might happen to do. Okay, so that will end the lecture. I'll show you the comedy clip in just a moment. And if any of you guys have questions after the class, we can meet outside and talk about those.